Today, AJ and I are talking to Randy Farmer, and this time from a historical standpoint, talking about basically everything you did. And well, let's start with telling from your own perspective, how did it all started with computers and electronics? What was the key for you, the key experience?
So the background that is interesting to me is I came to in the mid to late 1970s, and a couple of things were going on. I had grown up with the moon landing, and into Star Trek when it was in its syndication run. It was after it had been popular, and then got canceled, and now it was in reruns on off-brand, off-network channels, and I was a big fan because it was about space and the future and about optimism. I also was into Dungeons and got into Dungeons and Dragons late in the 70s. The role-playing game, which is now seeing a major popularity, but that back then was kind of a weird geeky thing. And I was in my junior high in the 1970s. I was introduced to a young man in our math class. They had a terminal that ran at 110 baud. That's 10 characters per second. It was a teletype, ASR 33 for the people who want to look it up, 33A. And you couldn't type faster than the modem could send, so you couldn't touch type because you were hammering the keys, because pushing down one key would force the other key up, kind of thing. It's like you see in old movies, the chugga machine. It was one of those. I had a paper tape punch and reader, so you could save your stuff on tape, physically carry it home, which was very interesting. And there was this young man who eventually would become my brother-in-law, good friend and brother-in-law for a while, who was in a grade older, and he had been using it, and he had found this Star Trek game called STTR1, which was a single-player game where it printed out a little grid using characters, and you typed in commands to move your ship from one space to another sector. And I was really fascinated by this, and I went home and I started. And the thing that was exciting then, and this is kind of like what happened with the browser when it came out, is any program you could play, you could see the source code for. You would type list, and you could see the source code. This is some really early BASIC. Was the name of the language. So he said, "Oh, you like this game? Let's work." And he typed list, and I was totally in that. There were a set of instructions that you could use to make a game. And I went home, and on my typewriter, because we didn't have personal computers, I typed a program based on what I remembered I saw. It was a guessing game, number guessing game. And I just remembered that the word input as input with an IM instead of an IN, and I made a bunch of other mistakes. And I brought it in and I showed it to this guy. And I said, Hi, I wrote my first program at home. What do you think? And he laughed at me. And that made me really all wrong. Okay. And I found that there were program manuals in the teacher's cabinet where the terminal was. And I immediately took to it. And my parents did something that changed my life forever, is they arranged for me to have access to the terminal after school so I could write programs and create things. I didn't realize what a big thing this was then, because there was no computer clubs. If there were, they were just forming. But I started writing programs. I discovered that the random number generator. So mostly what that terminal was used for is to play Bagel, a numbers guessing game, better known as Mastermind in tabletop form, where you'd say, number in the right place, but you got a number right, but in the wrong place, and you're supposed to get the least. You're supposed to do a game of elimination. Well, I found out that the random number generator was pseudo-random. I learned about pseudo-randomness, and I went, let's do this. Let me write a program that you run in front of Bagels that sets the pseudo-random number generator to a specific seed, and then run the program. So instead of running the program in the library, you ran it locally. You looked at things, type start Bagels, but instead of $bagels, you just type Bagels. It would run my program, set the seed, and then run Bagels, which meant I knew all the numbers in sequence it was going to generate. And I did that as a little magic trick. It's like, let's play Bagels. And they said, okay, what numbers you guys guess? And they guess. I go, I'm going to guess this, this, this. And they go, you got it right on the first guess. They went, oh, can you do that again? And I went, let's see, you guys pick a number. I'll pick a number. This, this, this. And I entered that. I said, you got it right. And that's when the teacher went, okay, this kid's going to be doing something. So they cleared the decks for me at the math department so that I could use the terminal. This led to me forming a computer club the first thing when I got into high school. I got into high school, I took a programming class as an elective 2 years before I was supposed to be able to, and then immediately founded the after school club. And in that after school club in the 70s, late 70s, I ran into some other cool guys who were interested in this stuff. This was a high school in Michigan. And one of them had this idea of creating a multiplayer Star Trek game. He called it SPB. That's short for Space Battle. He was from Yugoslavia. He didn't really understand the acronyms very well. But it's okay. SPB was a great name since you only had 6 characters to name your program anyway. He did a game. Let me see, I could share a screen of some of the source code here.
Okay.
This is source code from Doug Dragon's first attempt. Yeah, so this is Doug Dragon, a fraction of his source code from the original SPB. I have a printout of it.
Wow.
This would be 1975 or 1976. And this is the most sophisticated source code I'd ever seen. He was actually trying to do real trigonometry, in high school, in a really crude programming language. Notice that the variable names are one letter and maybe one number. And so you had to have a handwritten key to what all your variable names were. He's got some formulas in here that are pretty amazing. If you look at the middle of 7710, I have no idea what that does. But but you can see it's a combat thing. It's figuring out how much damage is being done to a ship by being hit by a weapon. And he was really excited about this 2-player game. The problem was he could never get it to work. And I took a shining to it. And I did something at the time that turned out to be a key in my life. I was so excited by this opportunity, I told him a lie the next time I saw him. I came in the next weekend and I said, Doug, I had a dream. I had a dream where we took your game and we made it multiplayer for more than just 2 players. Not just the Klingon and the Federation player, but you could add the Romulan player and maybe some more. And we would be forming teams in our high school. And it could have one school against another because we're all connected to the same computer through dial-up. And we could play a multiplayer game against each other because he had thought of this one idea, which is a way for software to share resources, which is now a given. Back then on this machine was considered impossible. But he figured out a way for us to have a universe that could be managed across different instances of this program running simultaneously. And I thought it was genius. And so I said, let's do this. And we teamed up. He couldn't get it to work. I teamed up with him. And we made a multiplayer version. And that vision I made up came true. There were high school players across southern Michigan, in the Detroit area of Michigan, were learning about this game, connecting, and we were playing multiple player games where we do teams, and it was an amazing time of life. And I've got a whole bunch of stuff I saved. We had a little mini convention so that people from the different schools could meet with each other. You can date it very carefully because Star Trek the motion picture came out, and we had a big event for everyone to go watch that. I have newsletters, fairly poor grammar that people wrote and stuff like that. So I wrote multiplayer gaming tools to go with this, which are message boards and chat, supported this game. If I got another screen I can share for you here. So I can show you a little bit of what the game is because this game is so popular with all the people who played it. We still have a version of it running.
Wow, amazing.
From 1976 today. It's been a project that's been written and rewritten. Here's the initial, it's falling apart. Here's the original manual. I'll put it on camera for you to see that though. Here we go. So this is a copy of the original SQD manual, little hand-typed pages that we reduced and cut in half and stapled together. In fact, the staples just came out. They're very old. And of course, I'm wearing my SQD t-shirt. This is the second generation one. The first one got sold. It's ratty, it's tore up. But this was one we made in the 1990s, and we got together for a big meeting. We have this game. We could play it. For example, I can start it now. So this is a much more advanced interface. It was just the text in the middle. This is a command line interface only. And so you would type in commands like computer, AW for auto warp, and I say I'm going to go to some coordinates. So it was a 3D combat simulator, but it was all text. And it would be literally, you type commands, and the stuff would come in asynchronously. So the stuff you see on the left and the right, not there. Of course, we've since added, a damage report and a viewport for seeing where you're going, and system maps, so we can zoom in and see where we are in 3D with pop-up. All this stuff is stuff just we've added, but still on top of the main game.
A sweet
the
LCARS
interface. Right now is versus the Doomsday Machine, so I can see all the ships flying around, which is really great for understanding what's going on. This game and how people interacted was very interesting. The way the game played out. Let me quit the game, otherwise it's going to distract me.
Well, if you still enjoy playing your own game, that's good.
That is
so we work on revisions and updates and.
Just wanted to say the original probably wasn't as colorful.
No. It was just text. I actually have text printouts of that too, which is just text on paper, and it just roll off. The paper would scroll. It would burn a lot of paper. And you were typing things. You never got an image, right? You literally got told what the coordinates of something were. And if you got close enough to something, it would get this spammy display that showed coordinates and directions, and you have to try to figure it out. And the fire weapons, you had to do trigonometry in your head. It was all kind of crazy. But what was interesting about the game is it taught me my first lesson about social, one of my first lessons, and that is the game started with you in your home territories, and you typically want to the goal was to destroy the enemy's ships or the enemy's bases. That's it. That was the victory condition. So you'd have like 3 power wars, Romulans, Klingons, and Finns. And so the first thing you would tend to do is fly. You have to fly a significant distance, like travel times of tens of minutes. Nothing like a game today, where you imagine a game where you say, okay, I'm on my way, and you're not in combat mode for 10 minutes. Maybe you'll be lucky and you'll encounter someone at the border. You might get into a skirmish there. But if you plan it carefully, you didn't do that. So what happened is people spent all their time in the command to send messages. So you can send messages to your teammates about strategy. You go to the bases, I'll defend our bases, those kinds of things. But another thing you could do is taunt. You could taunt the other team. So back then there was a comedic, a bunch of Star Trek material came out in books where there were jokes in them, like Klingons fart in airlocks. And that was just a fun thing to send if you had Klingons against you. And so you could do this entire social game. And the social game became the important part of the game. You could win or lose the entire game based on what you did in that messaging and how it influenced the behavior of the other player. You could make fun of someone kind of personally to get them mad and then have them say, I'm going to come and kill you. And all of a sudden, whatever their strategy was is out the window as they're chasing you around in the quadrant. And I learned a lot. And by the way, it's because of that I think the game is still intact, because it's not a great game. It does not hold up strategically against any modern space flight combat simulator. But we still play. and we still work on it. It's literally being changed as we speak, and it created a community, all that communications, and also playing Dungeons and Dragons, which is a big part of my career. All of these things found a foundation for what I am now. I call myself a social or community software product catalyst. I help people figure out how to find the social in product design. Usually web product designs, but game companies. I'm currently advising two game companies, a future streaming company and Playable World, which is Ralph Koster's new company. And if you don't know Russ Koster, he was the creator of the lead designer for Star Wars Galaxies, and before that, a designer on Ultima on two of the granddaddies of playing games, but not the most granddaddy. As I spoke to you before, the most granddaddy, of course, is Lucasfilm Habitat, which we saw in their interview. But the path of my career goes through this very focused on social, how humans interact with each other. So it goes through. Do you have any questions before we move on away from STV? But you can always come back to it because it's always there.
Got anything, Eric?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's amazing. It's really amazing that you basically, as I said, concentrate on social interaction long before others even thought about, before the internet actually, So it's totally amazing for me. I guess that is the point where you actually started working for Lucasfilm Games, or wasn't that the thing that came next?
Eventually, there's this path when I'm in late high school. I build SPB. I should share another thing, and that led to this. And this also is a big part of my career. If you look at this award, see that Doug Dragon and Frank Farmer of Henry Ford II High School won second place in the first annual programming contest for computer-based instruction in Michigan.
Only second place?
Yeah, second place. So that's what my father said, and it crushed me for years because I thought I didn't good enough. The truth is, it should be first. Everyone thought it should be first. There were two mitigating factors. Remember how I said this game's always been under modification? Well, it turns out the day the department decided to play it, it was broken. We sent the work. We didn't understand things like you make an archival copy and you don't touch that. But after the judging, in fact, several of the judges joined SPB and started playing it. One of the judges loved it so much he rewrote it once. I have a copy of a manual. He took an entire branch and built his own branch of SPB from scratch in Southern California, and he started putting in graphical things. That's a different branch than the one I showed you, which I consider basically the main branch. But I don't care. I mean, it was just really exciting that it inspired so many people. But this certificate came from a guy named Thomas B. Hartzig, and he is, in fact, was my boss because he hired first me and then Doug to work for the school district and write software for mini computers or microcomputers that were coming out. Commodore 64 eventually, but the Commodore PET first and the Radio Shack, Trash 8, TRS-80. So we were writing those cassette games, the educational games for the school district. There was this movement in the late 70s and into the early 80s of school districts, a few of them, especially in the northwest states, north central states, were writing educational software, initially on cassette tapes and then on floppy disks. That led to working professionally on some educational software. Tom Hartzig formed a small startup. He hired a high school student who were just graduating. We wrote games, and that eventually led to me going to California and working for Lucasfilm Games, where in fact, I was given a contract to work on the Apple II version of Coronis Rift, which is real-time fractals, 3D fractals on an Apple II computer with 6 colors, even though you normally can't do that. And Chip Morningstar, who was the tools guy, was working on a game design for something that would eventually be called Lucasfilm Habitat. And when I took that contracting job, I really wanted to work for the games company, Lucasfilm Games. So I demanded that they supply me a desk, and I would commute as a contractor. I didn't want to be a part of the team. That paid off really well, because when he saw what I was doing with the Apple II version of Chrome, to be on my team. And then he and I were kind of the lead, him back end and core engineering, and me client lead on Lucasfilm Habitat.
So it's
now we're up to Lucasfilm.
So you actually first started working on education games, and then you started working on real games. It's
right.
An interesting path for because normally you would say education games is the least favorite kind of software any developer would like to work at. Of course, I don't know how it was for you back then, but I remember that education software was always the reason for parents to buy a computer.
Well, I remember as a kid, when I got my first piece of software published, it wasn't like a fun game thing. It was just more like a tech demo for a printing thing. But it was just the idea, like I'm getting paid to program, which I like doing. I don't care what I'm programming. I don't care what they ask me to do, as long as I'm getting paid for it, and I like doing it.
So I worked in educational software for quite a while. There was a lot of different forms of it. It wasn't all just tutorial and practice. I did some work. For a while, I was working for the special education department, and so there was a lot of software having to do with tracking, diagnoses. But I enjoyed working with the people who were doing things to help children to see if we could use computers, usually with some hardware mods. So Apple IIs were really good for this. With things like muscle control and other kinds of things, special education needs. So it turns out, even today, there's still a lot of educational use. It's just not. The original idea was write games and put math in them, and it's kind of like talking about gamification today. I really detest it. For over a decade, I've detested the word gamification. Where you take something that's otherwise boring and then supposedly put a game on it, and all of a sudden it's not boring anymore. In practice, that's not true. What you have is a game people play, and they still don't do the boring part. What you need to do is design differently. And so early on, educational software was very much kind of the boring part. It's like, let's make a game, and that will teach you something. And it's like, okay, that's not a big piece of curriculum. It was much more better for things like science simulation, when you had an expensive setup, like dissecting a frog is probably a really good thing to do with a simulation.
Yes.
In terms of cost
Interestingly, I interviewed the guy who designed Operation Frog already. He's in our list.
And what did he say about it?
Well,
I'm curious. What did he?
Well, he said he was basically interested in computer graphics, so he took a course in 76 at a high school in computer graphics, and then he was asked to do education software, and then it happened to be Operation Frog, and as you probably know, Operation Frog even caused a law change in California, because a student in 83 demanded that she wants to take apart a frog, not in real life, but only on the computer. So that software really got very famous.
I wish we had that software when I was in school because we still had to do frogs, and I was not happy about that. I like frogs.
Yeah.
So this is one of those examples where education software really got famous and changed society.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed my 4 years at Lucasfilm Games, but we've already talked about pretty much in your previous interview.
True.
But the point is, for those who don't listen to my other interview, we created the first MMO, the first virtual reality, the first 3D rendering engine, only 2D objects, but and it was on a Commodore 64 300 baud. So I was still in the universe where we were doing the impossible because no one told us we couldn't. And Lucasfilm Games, of course, was the place to try anything. George Lucas ran the thing. It was amazing. He didn't run the day-to-day. That was run by a guy named Stephen Arnold. He should get all the credit. But he was, George provided this little pocket of Skywalker Ranch where we could do things. And we could do pretty much whatever we wanted if we could find someone to pay for it. And Lucasfilm Games, their big secret was they were into stone soup. And Lucasfilm's Habitat happened not because Lucasfilm Games wanted to pay for it, because Lucasfilm Games found someone who would pay. And oddly, they were a job shop, but we got to define whatever jobs we wanted to do, and then we shopped for someone to pay for them, which was pretty cool.
That's interesting.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Just
from there, I went on to it's called the Yeah.
Just because I looked it up, the designer of Operation Frog was John Mack. And
cool.
So because we mentioned it earlier, I forgot his name. So it was John Mack, and he designed the Operation Frog 83 for the Apple II first. Yeah.
And so I also want to point out, you just mentioned Habitat and the time at Lucasfilm, and this was something that we did cover on the podcast, but also I wanted to mention that aside from being the original Habitat, which was then kind of neutered and turned into Club Carib, it also ran on CompuServe in the 90s.
Later on, under the name Worlds Away. Yes, we rewrote it for Fujitsu in Worlds Away. Project called.
I also see one that's called Dreamscape.
Yeah, so Dreamscape is the name. So Worlds Away was the product name,
right?
Initially, Dreamscape was the first world that was on it, and then it spun off into a whole bunch of other companies. So I highly suggest going to projectreno.org if you're interested. RENO. Reno was the code name for Worlds Away before it had an official name, and Stu Blad is a British guy who's kind of the archivist for understanding everything about the history of Worlds Away, and he has a Slack and everything. If you are listening to this and you ever used Worlds Away, or there are so many names. There were Japanese versions, Korean versions. There were Pride-based versions in the United States. There were a number of different worlds built and launched using that platform. And if you're familiar with them or you're interested in connecting, projectreno.org is the place you want to go. I have this interesting thing. This is true for Lucasfilm. This is true for Worlds Away. It's true for several things. I often help start things. That's one of the reasons I call myself a catalyst. I'm often not there when they come to full fruition. Move on to the next thing. Judge me how. But it just seems like I help get things started, help establish what they are and how they work, and how and procedures for figuring out how they'll change, and then I tend to move along. So to tell the truth, when we talk about like Lucasfilm's Habitat never shipped. It was in test for 3 years. Hundreds of people used it. And the Neohabitat Org Project, which is the resurrection of that, which I led, is a picture of it as of the day it shut down. and then became Club Kareem. And there's a separate world built on top of the same model, which is called Club Kareem. That is the one that shipped Quantum Link to Link Club Kareem. And in fact, the same guy who's got the Project Reno archive is looking for volunteers to help reconstruct the Club Kareem world.
Oh, really?
There's screenshots and maps, and it just needs people who want to contribute to this open source project to create a second instance.
So maybe we should talk to him as well.
Yeah. So I'll introduce you to Vlad. And he is single-handedly kind of leading that effort right now and is looking for more volunteers. For those who played, so there are more people who played Club Kareem than played Lucasfilm Habitat. But I know Lucasfilm Habitat up until that day, so I could say this is how it worked on that day, and then we can proceed. This would happen again with other services, like I said, Worlds Away. I helped them get the software working, establish the narrative, which is the dreamscape. And then they took it from there. And if you're interested in Worlds Away, contacting him is good. If you're interested in Worlds Away operations, like the people who took care of it, my co-podcaster, Scott Moore, is a good person to talk to about the community side, about what it's like to run an early graphical virtual world. So after that, I wanted to do something that would make some money. Games were fun. I really enjoyed that stuff, but we had this idea of the American Information Exchange in the late 80s, early 90s. The problem is this is about 5 years too early. This would have kicked ass on the internet. But the internet, meaning the web, as we know it, didn't exist during it. Just before that, we built this software that allowed you to buy and sell information with other people, a complete negotiation mechanism. It collected taxes. It did all the stuff you're supposed to do. In fact, it was ahead of even eBay or Amazon until eBay until a couple of years ago. I was very excited to work on that project. It was very business, very straightforward. It was ahead of its time. Like I said, if we built it for the web, we would have been eBay. But this is a problem. Being visionary, sometimes you're way out ahead. But we did do some innovative work there recently. Someone featured our negotiation model in their talk about the history of online negotiations, and that's kind of interesting.
So was this communities.com?
No, that was AmericanInformation.com.
Oh, okay.
Communities.com was us. It was kind of interesting. What happened was, during the same time the American Information Exchange is failing, there's a gap here if you look at my thing. We are consulting and building Worlds Web for Fujitsu. Fujitsu also contracted us to say, if you could build anything you want, what would you build? And so we gave them this wonderful document called the Future Interactive Network, the fine plan, in which basically we describe what would be the web. Just a little early. We're saying, oh, well, you'll be able to do commerce on it. You'll be able to move bitmaps, and videos on it. You'll be able to do all these things. And we said, you know what? We should form a company to try to do something like that. Fujitsu did not want to invest. They had already invested. So we created communities.com. And what we did was we took the technology designs that we put way back in Lucasfilm Habitat, and we started building another server, and we decided we're going to make the ultimate fully distributed multi-user platform for commerce and games. And we just done commerce, and we saw it was really complicated and hard to sell. So we decided to do games again, since we knew what we were doing, a virtual world. So we made something called EC Habitat, Electric Communities Habitat. So originally, Electric Communities became communities.com over time. And at that location, we invented a lot of cool things. We were working closely with the people who were working in the future of programming. Java had come out during this period, and we designed. We designed stuff that used futures and promises, which are now finally making their way into languages like JavaScript. This is where we started. This is where they first were deployed, was at communities.com. I wrote some of the first distributed world objects that used features and promises. I literally wrote code in a language called E, which was Java extended to contain futures, promises, and other features. Communities.com, we made E. We did a whole bunch of stuff with distributed objects. We still have a model that I don't think anyone's duplicated, which we call the agency model, which instead of client and server being clearly defined roles, and you are either a client or a server, with our agency model, everybody is a client and everybody is a server. You are a client for everyone else's objects. You are a server for your objects.
That sounds a bit like peer-to-peer, or am I a bit off here?
Well, so that was interesting. There's a question in terms of network routing. The initial work was very peer-to-peer-ish, but we eventually discovered that didn't have the properties you wanted. And it's certainly not peer-to-peer in the sense we think of in the distributed sense, like a blockchain or distributed ledger. There was a source of trust for every object, right? And that instead of being, we all agree on the trust, it was literally, no, I am serving my avatar. And so the model was very specifically about you can keep in control of your objects. When you go somewhere, the server you connect to can enforce policy. So you might have to produce a certificate that says your objects are not lewd in order to get into a children's server.
Right.
Right. And if you look up communities.com, you'll see videos of me describing this. I'm trying to remember the name. I'll send the link later. I'll send a link to the video of me explaining and demonstrating how you cannot pass through a portal. So the idea was you have these graphical doors. When you walk through a door, you may go to another server. If you do, that's the point at which it would enforce protocol and perhaps require certificates or other things. So our model then was certificates for distributed objects. So we innovated a lot of stuff there. You'll see this pattern over and over. 2001, the shit hits the fan. There's a long story there about merging with thepalace.com and Traveler. And those each had their own communities, and they each had their own work and their own spin-offs. As far as I know, Stu Vlad is also coordinating, kind of keeping track of like the Traveler community as well. He's trying to pull all of the historical servers or an understanding of where they are and who can run them now together. An interesting thing happened. I haven't talked about Neohabitat. I'm going to run ahead and talk about Neohabitat a little bit because it affects the rest of the story here.
But before we do that, actually, you won an award for that, right? You won an award, and it says it's called the first Penguin Award.
Yeah, the first award. So it's now known as the Pioneering Award. So the IGDA gives an award every year for pioneers. So these are the people who have done amazing things in their career that have moved the industry. I was fortunate enough, Chip and I were fortunate enough to represent the Habitat team in receiving the first award of that type, which is a real honor. It was, at the time, it was called the First Penguin Award. And the reason it's called the First Penguin Award is because Noah Falstein, who happened to work with us, Lucasfilm, was on the committee and said that's what they should name it because of the story of the first penguin. And for those who don't know the story of the first penguin, the first penguin, if you watch videos of penguins on ice floes, you'll see them crowding to the edge of the ice floe. And what they're doing is they're looking into the water and trying to figure out if it's safe to go in, because although there's good, yummy fish in there, there are also sharks and things that eat penguins in there. And so they keep looking to see, are there any sharks or is it just fish? And that tension just doesn't work. The problem is all the penguins in the back, they want fish too, so they're pushing. And they push. And if you watch, not because he jumps in, but because he's pushed in, some penguin ends up into the water. And then they all watch to see if anything eats the penguin. And if it doesn't, they all go flowing in. And so that was the metaphor they chose at first for this pioneering word. It was the people who got pushed into the water and lived. Did not get eaten. And Chip and I were honored. It is in fact a pride of my life that we have this award. We share it. We pass it off every few years. For being the first penguins, for in effect creating the MMO. And showing you could do it on incredibly slow, 30 characters per second modems, up to 1,200 characters, or 120 characters, so 300 bytes to 1,200 bytes, on a Commodore 64 with only 64K of memory, of which 30K was dedicated to double buffered screens. So it's like almost no space, and somehow we managed to do a stack, a video game, a platform stack. And okay, so back, and yeah, you're right, that happened about then, at communities.com. And there were many people who worked on that project, and we talked about it then. You can look it up. I think her speech is online at GDC or the IGDA, one of the two. So at communities.com, we built things. I built worlds for the Palace, for EC Habitats. We prototyped a lot of and built a lot of amazing things. We had a really cool feature, for example. Our problem has always been we over-engineered things. So those agencies we talked about meant that we had a feature that everything was stored at all times. So if you took your server down and you brought it back up, it automatically resumed where it left off. There was no save operation. All objects rolled forward. It had a mechanism for revising objects going forward in time. It was this amazing. We had computer with things called bats. We had computation loops, environments that were protected. A lot of work for what ended up looking like a virtual world, but it was meant to be a platform for distributed shared objects. I'm still interested in those today, seeing where those are going. After that, we went on and realized betting on games was a mistake. We didn't make a lot of money at community time. We got paid and stuff, but there was no big breakout. We said, well, no, let's go back to business. And Chip Morningstar, Doug Crockford, and I, Chip and Doug Crockford founded this company. I joined them early, called this State Software. And this is in the early 2000s. Browsers in their 4.x versions, starting to head to their 5.x version. And we created JSON there. And we created, in parallel, other people were creating the same thing, not JSON, but they were creating application frameworks for web. So that web would be changing from static web pages with just submit buttons to dynamic things like we have today. So like that space battle thing I showed you is all a dynamic web page. Was running a web, it's not even a client, right? So we were switching to the idea that sessions are clients. Well, guess what? Our whole career has been sessions are clients, right? That's how Habitat works. So again, another version of the Habitat object model was built again for State Software. And we built on top of it JavaScript stacks. And with that, we discovered we needed a way to send messaging back and forth. And no way XML made any sense because modems were still slow, and it was stupid to send 40K worth of encoder decoder for XML when it already knew JavaScript. And the story of JSON is fairly well documented. Doug Crockford is kind of the champion of that. Although my version of the story is different than his. I was actually in with the story. He leaves me out, but it doesn't matter. That's how these things are.
Different versions of the story.
Yeah. Oh, so I'm a student of social, and I'm a student of psychology, and I'm not surprised the stories are different. The story he tells is a really good one, and it has elements of things that I remember, just not those objects, not those days. And if you're interested in that, there's some great stuff in podcasts. One podcast goes, "You Are Not So Smart," and another one whose name is escaping me, which are exploring this these days about differences in memory. In fact, we don't even have the same perception. I don't know if you guys remember. Do you remember that dress that was going around? Is it a blue and black dress or a white and gold dress?
Oh yes.
Yeah, dig into that. If you look for the episodes related to that on the You Are Not So Smart, you will find out that in fact the reason people see different things is because they have different histories in their lives. Literally.
Right.
It's their product.
It reminds me a bit of when I interviewed the Commodore pioneers about the VIC-20 and C64. I learned that those colleagues actually say what this person told you is wrong. My version is the correct one. So it's kind of a battle within the company. Who tells the stories more accurate than the other one, you know? So I can relate to that.
And here's the problem, it's not provable. And so I'm happy to say I have a version of the story I would love to tell you someday. But I'm not about to say that someone else's story is wrong, just saying it's not how I remember it. And I'm fascinated by that stories, my whole career has been about people telling stories with each other and participating in stories. Like I said, I'm heavy into role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, where we create shared narratives. But if you ask any of us what the narrative was, we will tell you a different story. And that's okay. That's what being social is. It's not about a camera, a perfectly well, oiled camera that knows exactly the facts and only the facts. No one lives that way.
Right.
And I say thank goodness. So the problem with state software is we pinned everything on Jason is the future. We were right just too soon. No one would buy our software because it wasn't XML. And when we tried to wrap it with XML, it just became stupid. And so Doug Crockford gets all the credit for rescuing Jason out of state software. He said as the CEO, he was running the company, he said in order to cleanly shut down the company, the people who wanted to shut it down, the funding sources he said, let me take this open source, let me take control of this, and I will help you, since they were going to pay him to, shut the company down. And so he traded. And the world got Jason, which was an amazingly great trade. And by the way, only the people who originally created it called Jason. Everyone else pronounces it a different way. It's okay, you can pronounce it however you want, just like I remember. So after that, I've done too many startups. I've done a lot of startups that have failed. Sure, I've made my salary, so I'm not desperate or anything, but the big payoffs never came. So I switched to becoming, working for a big company. I went to work for Yahoo for 5 years.
Yes.
And let's just say, big companies, I've now done this 5 years at Yahoo and 1 year at Google. They don't like moving. They're big ships and they don't like to change direction, even when you point to them saying, we're going to crash into a bunch of icebergs. We don't have to. They still crash into them anyway.
So for Yahoo, you worked on Yahoo 360?
I did. I was actually one of the lead designers on Yahoo 360. If you look at my patent portfolio, you'll find a number of patents associated with Yahoo Open Strategy and Yahoo 360. So a thing to look at if you're looking at, he's claiming to invent all this stuff, just if you're not sure, look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll see all the patents that match all the things I'm saying. Fortunately, most of them have expired, which is good news for everyone. I didn't list in here that I did a lot of consulting over these years, up until 2014, when a court decision came down that you can, in fact, throw out patent cases early, if they're bogus. The Lucasfilm Habitat, for example, and also basically all the work I've described today is prior art. One of the disadvantages of being too early is that no one wants you yet. They don't know they need you yet. One of the advantages is you've now made it public domain. You've either patented it, and it will be eventually. You cannot get sued for it because it existed 5 years before you thought it did.
Right.
And so that was very nice. We got to use Habitat to, for example, if you read my blog on the subject at habitatchronicles.com, that's Chip and I have a blog there, you'll see the story of how I saved the word balloon. That word balloons above your avatar's head, someone was actually claiming the patent they had applied to that. And we used Habitat to crack that patent. And gutted it. The whole story is there about how it got gutted.
And as we mentioned we talked about it a little bit on the podcast, but we can say it again here, that Habitat has been huge as far as setting law precedent.
Yeah, it was. I was going to jump ahead and talk about the as part of that, since we're in context, the Neohabitat.org project, which brings Habitat back as of that date I mentioned, and that project was sponsored by and driven forward by the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment here in Oakland, California, and Alex and his crew managed to secure their intellectual property rights to allow us to do that. And it was a lot of work. And we had people having to translate things to Japanese and back and all kinds of things. But we were able to use it as an example of what happens when you do open source a server for an old technology like this, an old game. What does and doesn't happen. How much work it was, and why the exemption that is in the copyright law that exists already for allowing libraries and museums to copy software should be extended to servers, so that you can run historical servers. And I'm proud to say that the MAID and their legal team, and using Habitat as one of the examples of what it is and how it could be used, did get that exemption, that we widened the exemption for museums and libraries to allow them to create servers for products that are dead. You can read up on that over at the MAID.org, or link there from, I think, neohabitat.org will take you there. And so I'm very, very proud of, not only does Habitat kind of break copyright, bad patents, it's helped wedge open the ability to do future game servers besides Habitat. And I know Alex is interested in bringing other servers or other popular servers back as, historical artifacts, showing what we did back then and how it's different. I'm very proud of the work we did to create neohabitat.org, and that it is an open source project and it had so many contributors. But it's not a service. It's not a threat. The point, people literally, the industry's pushback was, well, if you run a server, people could make money off of it. And the answer is, well, no, you can say, no, you're not allowed to make money off of it, one. And two, you won't. That's why you shut it down in the first place. It wasn't making money. That's why you're not running the game anymore.
Right.
And I love Habitat, but there's nothing like going in there and going, oh my gosh, this was slow and awkward and clunky and this. And it's like, but you need to see that. You need to understand that before we could literally fly in real time through 3D space, there were these clunky things. But some of the things you thought were new with your latest version existed in the 1980s.
Right.
Right. So neohabitat.org, for example, had housing. Ultima Online wouldn't have that for years after they opened. And Habitat had it from the first day. When you were born with an apartment or a house. It's like, yeah, I mean, so what does that mean? Well, no, we just threw everything in. It was kitchen sink to try to figure out what's going on. That's what experimentation is. But to see early experiments and see what the trade-offs were. There's a discussion going on, for example, about right now, because of COVID, what about online games, people playing remotely online games? What did we learn? Well, early on, the Neohabitat has checkerboards and chessboards. They're just pieces. There's a button that resets the board, and they're just pieces laying there in the room. You can't leave the room with them. And you're supposed to play the game you want. Well, almost no one did. It's too awkward. And you would like, for example, the piece to snap into place or not let you put it someplace illegal if you're playing chess and things like that.
Right.
So I thought, oh, this is great. We'll just leave you the pieces. You can play whatever you want. Well, that's true. But it turns out a little bit of help from a server, a judge, is really useful. And so it's been interesting watching the spread of like Jackbox TV, which are during this time of COVID. I play this every weekend. I'm playing this with my kids and grandkids, and it's like that's because they have just the right amount of game on the server,
Right.
and it's really like. So anyway, sorry. I'm always thinking about social and social interactions.
Well, it's all good. It's your interview. No problem. No problem.
While I was at Yahoo, though, I did gather a whole bunch of stuff together about social patterns, and nothing like being someplace for 5 years, talking to them about all the different social things they're doing, and gathering the lessons together into a book. And so, one of my coworkers and I started a book called "Building Web Reputation Systems" as a joint project between O'Reilly and Associates and Yahoo. I got laid off, but they wanted me to finish the book, so I finished the book. And that's a good book. If you're building a social system, and if you're thinking about things like leaderboards or reputation systems or ratings and reviews, you might want to pick up that book and then give me a call.
And that was in March 2009 you released it.
That is correct. Yeah, it's in desperate need of a update. I have a podcast called socialmediaclarity.net in which we talk about things not just from that book, but all kinds of things associated with social product design. And I've been updating a lot of my thinking. And during my year at Google, one thing I came to the conclusion to is that 5-star ratings should die a horrible death.
Okay.
There are almost no context in which they work the way you think. And I put together a deck there. Okay. I need to reconstruct from scratch that gives you the 10 reasons they shouldn't exist, such as one of my favorites, any place that has media that is consumed by, let's say, men and women, the women are getting the short shrift because men rate more objects than women. Men rate women's focused objects lower.
Yeah.
And men's objects higher, which means because there are more men than women voting, that women's objects are getting the short shrift. That, in fact, just doing gender alone, it turns out there's multiple dimensions that this is occurring on, but the gender one's the easiest one to see. So if there's a content focused on women, it will always be rated lower in average than content focused at men. And it has nothing to do with quality. What you think those stars mean don't mean it. My opening slide is this. It says 4.5 stars. It shows 4.5 stars, and it says, is this a good or a bad rating? And then you go to the next slide. It says it depends. You see, if you're a light bulb on Amazon, that's a good score.
Yeah.
But you don't want it to be too much higher. That's kind of the top end. If it goes beyond that, people start to suspect you're doing something. But if you're an Uber driver, you're fired. 4.5, you're fired.
Yes.
You got to be 4.6 or higher. So what does it mean, right? These stars are contextualized. How do you know? I have a T-shirt, image of a T-shirt I saw that says, if you arrive and you're alive, that'll be 5 stars. And it's meant for Uber drivers. Right? It's crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to unpack all that here.
It's all fine. You mentioned Google a couple of times, but I can't find anywhere what you did at Google. It's not in your profile.
My profile does. It's there. It says Social Product Design Catalyst Contractor for Adecco Google. So first of all, I worked for a contracting firm that leased me to Google. But guess how much time I spent with the contracting company? The first day I met them when I signed the papers. That's it. That's how that works.
Okay.
But
now I can see it.
But I'm not allowed to actually put the word Google. So they very specifically saying you cannot say you work for Google. But I did provide. So I've been a consultant on social software design now for well over a decade. Some would say 2. And that's the expertise I provided to them. I worked in their group that was trying to figure out social. They were initially focused on abuse mitigation. I was trying to point out to them that trust issues would be more useful to them. I spent a lot of time talking to YouTube about their stuff. Most of the time, they didn't listen to me. Some of them did.
We've had that experience.
I was there for almost a year. I gave 8 keynotes. I kept getting invited to give keynotes to teams because the leaders would see, wait, this is stuff we should be paying attention to. I give keynotes at their various design meetings. And it was surprising how few actually deeply engaged. It's going to be hard when I say, you're collecting ratings and reviews from people and your numbers are bogus. And I'd show them why, and they don't like that because that means their numbers are bogus. But I think you'll see some changes. Actually, 2020 should see some changes. You'll see people moving away. At least one of the groups will be moving away from stars. Because what they do, for example, if you're gathering ratings and reviews, you only understand the stars if you contextualize them. And the only way you can really contextualize them is by looking at the profile of the person who wrote the review and by whatever text they put in. Well, Google accepts ratings with no text. And they hide the profiles, and they don't show the profiles of the raters. So they just average a bunch of numbers that come in. It's like you cannot understand text at all. There is no context in which that makes sense.
Interestingly, like 5 years ago at Facebook, when you left star ratings, you weren't even able to add text to it to explain why you gave it 5 stars.
But guess what they did last year? Facebook abandoned star ratings for businesses. So, you know what's funny? Is the first company that was on my list that abandoned star ratings? 3 major companies have abandoned them in the last decade. The first one, believe it or not, was YouTube. The problem is they put in thumbs down. They put in thumbs up and thumbs down. They should have gone just thumbs up and forgotten the thumbs down. But anyway, I don't even want to unpack that. But then Netflix abandoned them. They did not produce the results they were expecting. They did a whole bunch of math on them and found out it didn't work. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And then most recently, Facebook has abandoned star ratings. There are no longer star ratings for businesses. So they're on their way out. Most people don't realize it because they're not being told this explicitly, like I am. But yeah. And even I don't know if you've heard that Instagram has been testing not showing likes. And
yeah, I have heard about that. Yeah.
Like it. A lot of people like it. I like it because it creates this popularity contest amongst people, but also internally. If you don't get as many likes for this picture that you got for the last one, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to change what you want to do, right? And by the way, likes are tied to friends and blah blah blah. So anyway, I'm a big. There's a word for it. I'm forgetting that. Demetrication guy. I'm into. Let's stop publishing. Let's stop showing public metrics like that. Anyway, so that was a distraction. So most recently, I've been a consultant on and off for this the last what do I have here? 7 to 10, let's say 10 years. And sometimes I'll carve off and do a thing. So for a year, I worked on Neohabitat.org. I did a year at Google. But I wanted to make sure to mention one more. Suddenly Social. So I didn't mention my last company. There was a startup that took, guess what? Another version of the Habitat object model. By the way, if you're interested in using this, it's called Elko. It's open source, and you can grab it. Look for ELKO. Chip Morningstar is the archive. And this is the thing that implements the Habitat distributed object model. It's well documented there. But Suddenly Social, we took that and we were going to put it underneath mobile games. And we did put it under some mobile games. That company did not last long for numerous reasons. It lasted about a year. During that year, I became its CEO. And that's when I learned I never want to be a CEO.
Okay.
Something that's called the Peter Principle. So what happened is I did not join that company. I'd done too many startups and I wasn't going to do any more startups. I was going to either consult or work for a big company and get some stable income. But my friends were starting this one, and I was advising my friends, this Chip Morningstar, who I've already mentioned, Noah Falsey, who I've already mentioned, Gary Winnick, several of the Lucasfilm guys had formed a little startup, and I was advising them. They found out I was really good at coordinating the team and catalyzing the design and helping them make decisions because they were suffering from some decision lock. Because they had a lot of people with a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge and different things they wanted to do. That magic sauce I talked about realizing how people interact with each other and helping them come to see what they have in common and to move forward as a group. And they put me on. They had a customer, they had money, they had a bunch of things that made them look good. So I decided to join anyway. They put me in as the COO because I was helping them move the project along. The CEO drops out. We can't find a new CEO because we're too early a startup. And the investors. The reason that company had trouble with bad investors. The investors said, you don't need a CEO. They were wrong because we needed to raise more money. And that's when I found out what a CEO does. So up until now, as CEO, I was focused downward, all about the products, all about the people, all about, let's get the stuff done and get it out and let's figure out the problems and solve them. When you're CEO, you don't do any of those things. You do the other things, all the stuff that looks outward to investors, to your board, and all this other stuff. These are not the same skills. And I highly recommend if you're going to become a CEO and you've got no experience, you need to study under somebody. I would have gone insane if it weren't for two things. One is I got a bunch of advisors who helped me out a lot. And the other thing is I developed a hobby because I was no longer creating the world. I was no longer helping drive things forward. So, for example, engineers would create stuff. I would then go in and write scripts to try to, I couldn't code at the level they coded, but I could certainly write things that manipulated the game and things like that. And I could write game logic and things like that. So up until then, I'd been a part of the team. Now I was focused outward, and that was driving me crazy, so I couldn't make anything. So I started making paper terrain. So as a hobby, since then, since the 2012-ish, I made 3D terrain for, guess what, Dungeons and Dragons. And if you look up oldschooldm.com, you'll see all the cool stuff I do for my games. But this is what kept me sane. But it's always about making things. It's always about connecting people. That's my career, making things and connecting people.
Cool.
Wow.
Anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I have to say, this is so much info for 1 hour. It's packed. It's amazing.
Yeah, you're does this with some pioneers and stuff, but usually people are a pioneer of one thing, and it's like you've got a resume of like, oh yeah, this is, and it's so nonchalant as well. It's just like, oh yeah, I kind of invented this, and then this, it's sort of amazing.
So I want to make one thing clear. And I mentioned this a few times, but I didn't articulate it as distinctly as I am now. I helped people invent things. This is why I chose the term catalyst for my description. I believe those things wouldn't have happened with those people then there without me, but that's not to say I deserve primary credit. In fact, I believe that very few times in history is only one person deserve credit. We look at Elon Musk when SpaceX delivered astronauts to the space station just recently.
Yeah.
And we say Musk. It's like, no, it's the pile under him.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a large pile of amazing geniuses and hardworking people and dedicated people. And I'm not just talking about hierarchy. I'm talking about peers. I literally, I think about what my next book might be. And one of them is a book I'm going to call Sidekick, which is a book about all the people who worked closely with the person we think that did a thing. So when I was growing up, we were taught Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And as we got older as adults, most of us learned, no, he ran the company that invented the light bulb. And that's a clear one, but it's amazing. I think that's always the case.
Mm-hmm.
I look like, yes, I was there. Yes, I played some role. Sometimes that role was a little more leaderish, and sometimes that was a little more catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
I am so happy to have hung out with some really great people who invented a lot of great things together.
Right.
That reminds me a bit of when I interviewed Marty Cooper, who invented the mobile phone. He said, "No, I had the idea of the mobile phone, but the actual mobile phone was created by a team under me. So it was a team effort. But there's always one person who is counted as the inventor, and it's probably the most likely the person who had the idea of doing it. You know.
Well, I mean, you look at, like, again, go back to the Elon Musk analogy, and it's like I've got some issues with Elon Musk to begin with, but he's a decent engineer, but he's not a rocket scientist. And I mean, to actually launch people into space and have the thing come back down and land on their one, I mean, that is some serious rocket science happening, and that's
No
not
kidding.
That ain't him. He's not doing that.
No. So, like I said, I did mention it at the very beginning. I ran into this guy, Doug Dragon. He was stuck. His program was broken. I came back and sold him a dream, and we changed the world together because it became the root of our careers. Right? And so, did I do the thing? Well, no. He had already done a whole bunch of the heavy lifting. He just couldn't figure out what to do with it. And I saw it, and I went, I know what we could do with it. It's so amazing. If you read my father's memorial, if you type in Frank Farmer Memorial blog, you'll find a testament letter there from a guy who I worked with during software development back in the educational software days. And he tells the story of when I drove to his house and told him that we were going to give him a job at the school district because I was working there. And he says he realized what I was to him then, and his insight changed my life forever when he told me this after my father died. He said, Randy, it's your enthusiasm that's infectious. And he said, it's like in that movie Tucker, when the character played the Jewish lawyer guy whose name is escaping me, says, he's telling a story to Tucker. He says, that he ended up, Tucker convinced him to be in his car company. And he says, when my grandma, she told me this story, she said, don't get too close to people. You'll catch their dreams, he says. And of course, he says, only later in life did I realize she had a thick accent. She said, you'll catch their germs. But you, Tucker, people catch your dream. And I think I've been blessed with that. And I think a lot of the people who get credit are at the places where people do things like this. Is people are sharing their dreams, and sometimes people are better at articulating them or tripping them off. So SPB, which literally led to my entire career, multiplayer gaming, is a result of someone producing the most beautiful code I'd ever seen up until then, and a thing I cared about a lot, which is Star Trek, and convincing me that we have to do something. And I went, okay, we're going to do something amazing. And then I shot a goal, which was insane. Because he only had 2 people. And I said, let's make it N people.
Right.
And I somehow sold him this idea, and we did. And it was like, that's crazy. And I've been lucky enough to live my life. So although I've never had the huge payout from one of these companies, I do feel like I've had a very successful life, even though most of these companies I've described that I work with died fairly horrible deaths. I still feel blessed.
Well, at least you had your part in it and invented something or helped inventing things. And that's good.
I mean, that's so often the case with a lot of. You look at the classic game companies and all these things that existed back then, and so many of them have been, enveloped by something else, and they've morphed into whatever. A lot of these, it's. There's a time when they shine, and then it's like they fade away when they need to.
Well, for example, Broderbrand, who was in the early 80s actually making famous games. Now they are doing education software. I'm like, wow.
Well, they've been doing education software for a long time because they did the print shop. They did like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego on the C64 and whatever. Yeah. I mean, I always knew them as an educational thing because we had that stuff in school when I was younger.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
now they are not doing any video games things at all anymore.
Yeah,
so
right.
Yeah.
It's changed.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they were a cassette software delivery company too back in the day. They were based in Marin County, not too far from where I lived in Marin County at the time. And I got to know the CEO of that company. He became an investor in some of our earlier companies. He was a very big believer in education.
Pretty good, yeah.
I've really enjoyed doing this. It's very autobiographical. So it feels a little egocentric, but I appreciate the opportunity to share.
You know, usually when I interview people, the first step is convincing them to tell me about the old stories because they think it's too long ago and nobody's really interested in their stories, you know? So that's mostly the thing. And you were one of the rare people who said, like, last time, oh, it's too bad we didn't talk about the other stuff I did. So that's really very, very nice to finally meet somebody who likes talking about the past and what he did. And I don't have to convince him.
Yeah,
like,
we always have
please.
two points to convince. One is that no, we really want to talk about stuff that you did because a lot of people are like, you know, it's whatever. That was 30 years ago. It doesn't count anymore. And the other one is I don't speak English well enough.
That's another thing.
Yeah, and we don't. And it was perfect here. But it's also important to get this stuff because it's for archival purposes. You know, you really want to know this information. This is important stuff for down the road. And if we can, you know, talk about it for, you know, an hour or so, and this is now available. This will be available forever, or at least until YouTube dies a horrible death.
Or archive.org, because we mirror the stuff on archive.org. So, but as you see, when you mentioned like Operation Frog or Chris Crick, we spoke to the people. So I noticed in the first interview you were amazed that we already spoke to those people. You said like, "Wow, you know Chris Crick? That's amazing."
Yeah. Actually, he's hard to. That was mostly because he's hard to get a hold of.
I know.
The last time he confirmed that the last time I had talked to him was literally when we received the inaugural first Penguin Award. So,
but I'm not the person.
Those are long connections.
Giving up.
Yeah.
Right.
So I really appreciate. So I did it because I believe in sharing. If any of this could be helpful for people to understand why things were the way they were, it's been interesting encountering people say that think they understand how things used to work. Usually young people because they're new. And I think I shared a little bit last time. People thinking that Habitat, Lucasfilm's Habitat on the Commodore 64, shared a significant shared the rendering with Maniac Mansion. Because they're both Commodore 64 and high, you know, those kind of graphics.
Yeah, that's a mistake that I had made.
Yeah. And being able to share, no, this was a 3D renderer, rendering 2D objects, allows me to set the record straight that things don't look the way, you can't tell by looking at the results about what's in the guts. And that was all the way back in my story, all the way to the very first story about meeting Doug and looking at the guts of his code. Right? You look at the guts, you can say, that's interesting. The game wasn't running. No. Look at Lucasfilm Habitat and Maniac Mansion, you can say, look, they have the same graphic artist. You don't even know that it's the artist. So they must work the same. And then you look at it real close and you go, wait, if that's sprites, how can that work? And then it's that point of dissonance in which is the possibility to share understanding. And to say, just because something works one way doesn't mean you can't try something else. If we had to try to do it the way Maniac Mansion did it, we never would have done it.
Yeah. Well, there are tons of examples. One example would be Lemmings, which was always told to be impossible to do on a Commodore 64 because you have 100 little sprites. No, you don't have sprites. You actually have bitmap graphics that is animated, and instead of bitmaps for the background, you have char set graphics. You know, and that is why you have a limitation of 4 colors and like,
They've been saying things are impossible on the C64 for years, and they're still figuring out even now
Wow,
what they
stuff
can do
people
with
are making now are insane. It's like let's
Yeah.
remap every but they also don't have to deal with hardware. So this is funny. I told you before that big chip bug would have prevented most of the hacks people are building now. You had to deal with big chip A or B. Good luck with some of those amazing, cool color shifting hacks.
Well, I mean, a lot of this stuff still. I mean, I've got an actual C64. It's I mean, it's still, it's amazing the stuff that even just a stock machine can do. They're adding new hardware and stuff every day. I mean, there's an SD drive attached to it, so I've got, essentially I've got a 64 gig SD card in there, which is more space than you could hold the entire C64 library on that.
That's 1,000 C64s, right?
Yeah. Yep.
No, wait.
That's way more than that.
No. That's a million.
Yeah. So I mean, it's
yeah. I can't even do the math. It's so amazing. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the history.
Great, thanks for sharing.
I hope everywhere I mentioned the names of the people, some of the people who I was in it with. None of these are solo ventures. Even when I advise companies, it's my job to kind of teach them how to think about things, not to be the person doing being the center of the decision making. That has to live with them.
That's good. We like to take stories from different angles, different perspectives.
Yeah.
If I help do that, then it's worth it. So thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you, sir.
All right, bye, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.